In 2003, in the small farming town of Millbrook, population 412, a boy named Thomas Reed walked into the county records office on a Tuesday morning that smelled of dust and old paper. He was 15 years old, 5'6", with brown hair that fell into his eyes and hands that were already calloused from 3 years of working his uncle's dairy farm on weekends. He wore a faded green jacket that had belonged to his father, jeans with a tear in the right knee, and boots that were 2 sizes too big, stuffed with newspaper to make them fit. The clerk behind the counter, a woman named Doris who had worked in that office for 31 years and knew every family in the county by name, looked up from her crossword puzzle and asked what a boy his age was doing there on a school day. Thomas placed a folded envelope on the counter and said he wanted to buy the old Henderson orchard. Doris set down her pen and looked at him with an expression that mixed confusion with something close to pity. She told him the Henderson orchard had not produced a decent apple in 20 years. She told him the soil had been tested by the Agricultural Extension Office and declared contaminated. She told him 3 families had tried to revive it, and all 3 had gone bankrupt trying. She told him the town had a name for that piece of land, a name whispered at the feed store and spoken openly at the diner, a name that had stuck since 1983 when Old Man Henderson died alone in the farmhouse and was not found for 11 days. They called it the Cursed Farm. Thomas opened the envelope and counted out $347 in small bills and coins, every penny he had saved from working the dairy farm, from mowing lawns, from collecting bottles and cans along the highway. He said he had enough for the down payment, and he would pay the rest over 5 years. Doris called the county supervisor, who called the sheriff, who came down to the office and looked at the boy and at the money and at the property records that showed the Henderson orchard had been on the market for 8 years without a single offer. The sheriff asked Thomas if his parents knew what he was doing. Thomas said his mother was dead and his father had left when he was 4, and his uncle had told him that a fool and his money were soon parted, but that it was his money and his choice. The sheriff shook his head and signed the papers, and Doris stamped them, and just like that, at 15 years old, Thomas Reed owned 43 acres of dead apple trees, poisoned soil, and a farmhouse that had not had a working roof in a decade. The town found out by Thursday. By Friday, Thomas was the subject of every conversation at the Millbrook diner, the feed store, the gas station, and the church social that evening. At the diner, a farmer named Bill Hawkins, who had lost $12,000 trying to grow corn on the Henderson land in 1995, told anyone who would listen that the boy was either simple in the head or running from something worse than a cursed farm. At the feed store, the owner, a man named Joe who had sold fertilizer to all 3 families who had failed before, said he would not sell the boy a single bag of anything, not even if he paid cash up front, because he did not want the boy's failure on his conscience. At the church social, the pastor's wife took Thomas's aunt aside and suggested that perhaps the boy needed counseling, that buying a cursed farm at 15 was not the act of a healthy mind. Thomas heard none of this directly. He was already at the orchard, walking the property line with a notebook his mother had given him before she died. A notebook with a blue cover and lined pages that he filled with observations about the land. He noted where the soil was darkest and where it was palest. He noted which trees still had bark and which were hollow. He noted the direction of the wind and the angle of the sun at different times of day. He noted the location of the well dry for 15 years and the location of the creek that had run through the property in his grandfather's time but had disappeared sometime in the 1970s. He slept in the farmhouse that first night, on a mattress he dragged from his uncle's barn, under a roof that leaked in 17 places, with a flashlight and his notebook and a bag of apples he had bought from the grocery store because he wanted to remember what a good apple tasted like. The first year was not farming. The first year was archaeology. Thomas spent his mornings cutting down the dead trees that were too far gone to save. Using a chainsaw he borrowed from his uncle with the promise that he would replace it if he broke it. He spent his afternoons hauling the wood to a pile at the edge of the property, a pile that grew over 6 months to the size of a small barn. He spent his evenings reading books about soil chemistry and apple cultivation that he checked out from the county library. Books with titles like Orchard Management for the Small Farmer and The Biology of Malus Domestica that he read by flashlight because the farmhouse had no electricity. He discovered that the soil contamination the Agricultural Extension Office had identified was lead-based, from old paint that had flaked off the farmhouse and barn over decades and settled into the topsoil. He discovered that lead did not penetrate deeply, that it stayed in the first 6 to 8 inches of earth. He discovered that if he removed the topsoil and replaced it with clean earth, the contamination would be gone. He also discovered that removing 43 acres of topsoil would cost more than he could earn in 10 years. So he started smaller. He marked out 1 acre near the center of the property, an acre where the soil was least contaminated according to his own tests, with a kit he ordered through the mail for $29. He began removing the topsoil by hand, using a shovel and a wheelbarrow, working 4 hours every morning before the heat became unbearable, and 3 hours every evening after it began to cool. He carried the contaminated soil to the pile of dead wood and covered it with a tarp. He carried clean soil from the creek bed, where the earth had not been touched by the paint, and he mixed it with compost he made from the dead leaves and grass he collected. By the end of the first year, he had prepared 1/4 of an acre. He had planted 20 apple saplings that he had grown from seeds in his uncle's greenhouse, seeds he had collected from the best apples he could find. Apples he had driven 200 miles to buy from an orchard in the next state because he did not trust the local varieties that had failed before. The town watched and waited. Bill Hawkins drove by every Sunday after church, slowing his truck to a crawl to see what the boy was doing, then speeding up with a shake of his head. Joe from the feed store kept his promise and refused to sell Thomas anything, though he watched from his window when Thomas came to town for supplies. The pastor's wife sent Thomas a Bible with a bookmark at the passage about the foolish man who built his house on sand. Thomas thanked her and used the Bible as a paperweight for his soil test results. His uncle, a practical man who had warned him against the purchase but had not stopped him, came by once a month with a casserole and a 6-pack of beer that Thomas was too young to drink, but that he kept in the farmhouse for when his uncle visited. The uncle would sit on the porch, which Thomas had repaired with wood from the dead trees, and he would look out at the 1/4 acre of saplings, and he would say nothing because there was nothing to say. The trees were small. The leaves were sparse. The apples, when they came, were the size of marbles and sour enough to make a man wince. But they were apples. They grew on the cursed farm, and that was enough for Thomas to keep going. The second year brought a drought that lasted 4 months. The creek bed where Thomas collected his clean soil dried up completely. The well, which he had spent 3 weeks and $400 to repair, produced water for 6 weeks and then went dry again. The 20 saplings, which had grown to waist height, began to wilt. Thomas carried water from his uncle's farm 3 miles away in plastic jugs in the back of his truck, making 4 trips every day. He watered the trees by hand, pouring exactly 1 gallon at the base of each trunk. Because he had read that overwatering was as deadly as underwatering, and he could not afford to lose a single tree. The water cost him $40 a week in gas alone, money he earned by working at the dairy farm on weekends, waking at 4 in the morning to milk cows before driving to his own land to water trees. He lost 8 pounds that summer. He developed a permanent tan that made him look older than his 16 years. His hands, already calloused, cracked and bled and cracked again until the skin on his palms was as tough as leather. In August, a windstorm came through and snapped 3 of his saplings at the base. Thomas stood in the field and looked at the broken trees, and for the first time since he had bought the farm, he felt the weight of what he had done. He sat on the ground and held one of the broken saplings in his lap, and he cried, not because of the tree, but because of his mother, who had believed in him, and because of his father, who had not, and because of the town, who were waiting for him to fail, and because of himself, who was not sure anymore if he was brave or just foolish. The rock bottom came on a Wednesday in September of the second year. Thomas was carrying water from his truck to the trees when he felt a sharp pain in his chest and his vision went gray at the edges. He woke up on the ground, the water jug spilled beside him, the sun directly overhead. He had passed out from heat exhaustion and dehydration. He lay there for an hour before he had the strength to stand. When he finally made it to the farmhouse, he found a letter from the county tax office. His property taxes had increased because the county had reassessed the land based on the improvements he had made, the well and the cleared acre and the repaired roof. He owed $800 by the end of the month or the farm would be seized. He had $43 in his account. He sat on the porch with the letter in his hands and he looked at the 17 remaining saplings, small and struggling, and he thought about the rifle his uncle kept in the barn, the one his uncle had shown him how to use when he was 12, the one that was always loaded because of the coyotes. He thought about how easy it would be. He thought about his mother, who had died believing he would do something good with his life. He thought about how disappointed she would be. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket, and he walked to the truck and he drove to the dairy farm, and he asked his uncle for a loan. His uncle looked at him for a long time, longer than Thomas had ever been looked at, and then he went to his safe, and he counted out $800 in 20s, and he said, "This is not a loan. This is an investment, and if you ever mention that rifle idea again, I will beat you senseless." Thomas took the money, and he hugged his uncle, who smelled of cow manure and diesel fuel and something else that Thomas would later recognize as pride. The turning point came in the 3rd year, though Thomas did not recognize it as such at the time. He had expanded his cleared acre to 2 acres, planting 50 new saplings in the spring, using a loan from the bank that had finally agreed to give him credit when his uncle co-signed the note. He had dug a new well, deeper than the first, hitting water at 47 feet, water that was clean and cold and tasted of minerals. He had built a small greenhouse from salvaged windows and scrap lumber, where he grew rootstock for grafting because he had read that grafting disease-resistant rootstock to high-quality fruit stock produced stronger trees. He was 17 now, old enough to vote, old enough to enlist, old enough to be tried as an adult, but all he wanted was to grow apples. The turning point was a root, one root from one tree that grew sideways instead of down, that found a crack in the subsoil and pushed through it and found something that none of the soil tests had measured. The something was a layer of decomposed granite, porous and rich in potassium, that ran beneath the entire property at a depth of 30 to 40 feet. The root found it, and the tree, a Granny Smith that Thomas had grafted himself, grew twice as fast as its neighbors. Thomas noticed the difference in September, when the tree was heavy with fruit while the others were still sparse. He noticed again in October, when the tree's leaves turned gold 2 weeks later than the others, as if it had access to nutrients they did not. He dug around the base of the tree, carefully, with a trowel, and he found the root, thick and white, disappearing into a crack in the earth. He followed it with his hands, scraping away soil, until he found the granite layer, cool and crumbly and alive with minerals. He tested the soil around the tree and found potassium levels 3 times higher than anywhere else on the property. He tested the apples and found sugar content that rivaled the best orchards in the state. Thomas did not tell anyone, not his uncle, not the bank, not the agricultural extension office that had declared his land worthless. He spent the winter reading about root systems and subsoil geology, and the way trees communicate through fungal networks beneath the earth. He learned that apple trees send roots deep, deeper than most farmers realize, searching for water and minerals that the topsoil cannot provide. He learned that the decomposed granite layer was not unique to the one tree, but ran under the entire property, a gift from ancient volcanoes that no one had bothered to map because no one had bothered to look. He learned that if he planted his trees to encourage deep rooting, if he watered deeply and infrequently instead of shallowly and often, if he allowed the roots to find the granite layer instead of forcing them to stay in the contaminated topsoil, he could transform the entire orchard. In the spring of his 4th year, he planted 200 new trees, spacing them wider than conventional wisdom suggested, digging each hole 3 feet deep instead of 18 inches, placing a handful of the decomposed granite at the bottom of each hole as a signal to the roots of what lay below. The town, which had grown bored of watching him fail, barely noticed. Bill Hawkins had moved on to mocking a new family that had bought land near the river. Joe from the feed store had retired, and his son, who did not know about the promise, sold Thomas fertilizer at a discount because he felt sorry for the skinny young man with the haunted eyes. The pastor's wife had stopped sending Bibles and started sending casseroles, which Thomas accepted with gratitude and ate cold because he had no time to heat them year 4. The 200 trees took root. The deep holes and the granite signal worked. The roots found the layer and spread through it like a network, connecting tree to tree in a web of life that Thomas could not see, but could measure in the growth rates and the leaf color and the thickness of the bark. He grafted carefully, selecting for taste and disease resistance, keeping detailed records of which rootstock produced which results. He pruned aggressively, removing branches that competed for light, shaping the trees into forms that would bear fruit efficiently. He sprayed with organic compounds. He mixed himself from neem oil and garlic and soap, because he could not afford commercial pesticides, and because he had read that healthy trees resist pests better than weak ones. The trees grew, not fast, not dramatically, but steadily. By the end of year 4, the orchard looked like an orchard instead of a graveyard. The trees were small, most only 6 or 7 feet tall, but they were alive and they were green and they were covered in buds that promised fruit. Year 5, the first real harvest. Thomas, now 18, walked through the rows in September and touched the apples that hung from his trees, apples that were large and firm and colored a deep red with streaks of gold. He picked one and bit into it, and the taste was unlike anything he had expected. It was sweet, yes, but with an undertone of mineral complexity that he would later learn came from the granite layer, a taste that reminded him of the water from his deep well, clean and ancient and alive. He picked a bushel and drove to his uncle's farm, and he handed his uncle an apple, and he watched him eat it. His uncle chewed slowly, his eyes closed, and when he opened them there were tears in the corners that he wiped away with the back of his hand. He said, "Tommy, I have been eating apples for 62 years, and I have never tasted one like this." Thomas smiled, the first real smile in 5 years, and he said, "I know. I grew them on the cursed farm." His uncle laughed, a sound like gravel moving in a stream, and he said, "You need to sell these. You need to sell them right now, before someone else figures out what you have." Thomas sold his first apples at the Millbrook Farmers Market, a small affair that met in the parking lot of the Methodist Church on Saturday mornings. He set up a table with a hand-painted sign that read "Reed Orchard Apples," and he placed 12 apples in a pyramid, and he waited. For 2 hours, no one stopped. The market regulars walked past his table without looking, because they knew about the cursed farm, and they knew about the boy who had wasted his youth on dead land. Then a woman named Margaret Chen, who owned a restaurant in the city and who drove 60 miles every Saturday to buy produce for her kitchen, saw the apples. She saw the color, deeper and more complex than the apples at the other stands. She saw the size, larger than conventionally grown fruit. She saw the sign, hand-painted and crooked, and she saw the boy behind it, thin and sunburned and watchful. She asked if she could taste one. Thomas handed her a knife and an apple, and she cut a slice and she put it in her mouth and she chewed and her eyes widened. She asked how much for the bushel. Thomas said $15, because that was what the other farmers charged. Margaret laughed and said she would pay $50, and she would take everything he had, and she would be back next week for more. She gave him her card, heavy stock with gold lettering, and she wrote her private number on the back, and she said, "Call me when you have more. I know people who need to taste this word spread." Not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, the way that good things spread when they are genuine. Margaret Chen told her supplier, who told a distributor, who told a buyer for a grocery chain, who drove to Millbrook one Tuesday in October and found Thomas in the orchard, pruning. The buyer tasted an apple and he placed an order for 1,000 bushels for the following season, at a price per bushel that was 3 times the market rate. He said the apples would be sold as a premium product, a heritage variety from a restored orchard, and the story would be part of the marketing. Thomas said he did not have 1,000 bushels. The buyer said he would take whatever Thomas had, and he would pay up front, and he would be back next year for more. Thomas signed the contract in his orchard, with pruning shears in his back pocket and apple blossoms in his hair, and he drove to the bank and he paid off his loan, and he bought a new truck, cash, and he drove to his uncle's farm, and he handed him a check for $10,000, and he said, "This is your investment return." His uncle looked at the check, and he looked at Thomas, and he said, "Keep it, buy more trees." And then he went into his house, and he closed the door, and Thomas heard him crying through the window, a sound like rain on a tin roof. Year 6, the orchard produced 5,000 bushels. Year 7, 12,000. Year 8, 20,000. Thomas hired 3 workers from the town, men who had mocked him at the diner and the feed store, men who needed jobs because the dairy farm had cut hours and the mill had closed. He paid them $15 an hour, more than minimum wage, and he gave them apples to take home to their families. Bill Hawkins, who had driven by every Sunday for 5 years shaking his head, applied for a job, and Thomas hired him to manage the irrigation system. Joe's son from the feed store became his fertilizer supplier, not because Thomas needed much fertilizer anymore, but because he believed in supporting local business. The pastor's wife organized a church group to help with the harvest, and she told everyone who would listen that she had known from the start that the boy was special, that God had a plan for him, that the cursed farm was only cursed for those who lacked faith. Thomas smiled when he heard this, and he said nothing, because he knew that faith had nothing to do with it. It was granite, it was roots, it was water at 47 feet, It was 5 years of carrying water in plastic jugs and digging holes with bleeding hands and reading books by flashlight and crying over broken saplings. It was not faith. It was work. By year 9, the Reed Orchard apples were sold in 47 grocery stores across 3 states. By year 10, Thomas had appeared in 2 magazines and on 1 local television program, where the interviewer asked him how it felt to have proven the town wrong. Thomas, now 20, and still thin, but with a confidence that showed in the way he held his shoulders, said he had not proven anyone wrong. He had proven himself right, which was different and harder and more important. He said the town had not been wrong to doubt him. The land had been cursed, in a way, by neglect and contamination, and the failure of people who had not looked deep enough. He had simply looked deeper. The interviewer asked what he would say to young people who wanted to follow his example. Thomas thought for a moment and said, "Find your granite layer, whatever that means for you. Find the thing that everyone else has missed because they were looking in the wrong place. And then dig until you find it." Year 11 brought the buyers. Not grocery buyers, but investors, venture capitalists, men in suits who flew in from the coast and drove rental cars to Millbrook and walked through the orchard with clipboards and calculators. They offered Thomas $3 million for the orchard. He said no. They offered $5 million. He said no. They offered $7 million and a position as vice president of their agricultural division, with a salary and stock options and a corner office in the city. Thomas walked them to the edge of the property, where the pile of dead wood from his first year still stood, now covered in ivy and home to a family of foxes, and he said, "This pile is worth more to me than your $7 million. This pile is the wood from the trees that were dead when I arrived. I cut them down with a borrowed chainsaw, and I hauled them here by hand. Every board in my house, every beam in my barn, every step of my porch came from this pile. You cannot buy that. You cannot buy the morning I passed out from heat exhaustion and thought about a rifle. You cannot buy the night my uncle gave me $800 and told me he would beat me senseless. You cannot buy the taste of the first apple, or the look on Margaret Chen's face, or the sound of my uncle crying through a window. You can buy the land, and you can buy the trees, and you can buy the brand. But you cannot buy the story. And without the story, these are just apples." The men in suits went back to their rental cars and they drove away, and Thomas walked back to his orchard, and he pruned until dark year 12. The town of Millbrook had changed. Property values had doubled, then tripled, as people moved from the city to be near the orchard that had become a destination, a place where school groups came to learn about agriculture and where food writers came to taste apples that they described in magazines as having notes of stone and honey and something indefinable that they called terroir. The diner where Bill Hawkins had mocked Thomas now served Reed Orchard apple pie, and it was written up in a national food magazine as worth the drive from anywhere. The feed store where Joe had refused to sell Thomas fertilizer had become a cooperative, owned by local farmers, that specialized in organic supplies, and that carried a photograph of Thomas on the wall, labeled "Our First Customer." The church, where the pastor's wife had sent Bibles, now had a stained glass window funded by Thomas, depicting a tree with roots that went deep into the earth and a plaque that read, "For those who dig deeper." The county records office where Doris had processed his purchase still had the same clerk, now 63 and planning to retire, and she kept a copy of the original deed on her desk, framed with a photograph of the boy who had walked in with $347 and a dream that everyone else had called crazy. Thomas was 27 now. He had married a woman named Elena who had come to Millbrook to write an article about the orchard and had stayed because she believed in the story more than she believed in journalism. They had a daughter named Grace after Thomas's mother, who was 2 years old and who already knew how to hold an apple in her small hands. Thomas still woke before dawn, still walked the orchard every morning, still pruned with his own hands, even though he employed 23 people who could have done it for him. He still lived in the farmhouse, though it had been rebuilt and expanded, and now had electricity and running water and a roof that did not leak. He still kept the notebook with the blue cover, filled now with 20 years of observations, in a drawer in his desk. He still visited his uncle every Sunday, bringing apples and sitting on the porch that he had built from the wood of dead trees, talking about cows and weather and the price of grain. And he still drove past the sign at the edge of town, the sign that someone had painted as a joke in his second year and that had never been taken down, the sign that read, "Welcome to Millbrook, home of the cursed farm." Thomas had offered to buy the sign, to have it removed, but the town council had voted to keep it, with one modification. They had added a line in smaller letters beneath the original that read, "Where crazy dreams grow true." The buyers still came every year with larger offers and better terms. The last offer, in the spring of his 12th year, was for $12 million. More money than Thomas could spend in 3 lifetimes. He said no, as he always said no, and the buyer, a young man in an expensive suit who had never grown anything in his life, asked him why. Why would anyone turn down $12 million for 43 acres of trees? Thomas walked him to the center of the orchard, to the tree that had started it all, the Granny Smith with the root that had found the granite layer, the tree that was now 30 feet tall and so heavy with fruit that its branches required support. He placed his hand on the bark, rough and warm from the sun, and he said, "When I was 15, I bought this farm with money I had earned milking cows and mowing lawns and collecting bottles from the side of the highway." Everyone laughed. Everyone said I was crazy. Everyone said the farm was cursed, and they were right in a way. The farm was cursed for people who looked at the surface and saw dead soil and poisoned earth and a well that would not give water. The farm was cursed for people who read the Agricultural Extension Report and accepted it as final. The farm was cursed for people who believed in curses. But I was 15, and I did not know enough to believe in curses, and I was too stubborn to read the reports, and I was too poor to hire someone to tell me what I could not do. So I did it anyway, and I found the granite, and I found the water, and I found that the only curse on this land was the curse of people giving up before they looked deep enough. You can have the apples, you can have the brand, you can have the buildings and the equipment and the contracts, but you cannot have the granite layer, because it is not in the deed. It is in me, and I am not for sale. The young man in the expensive suit went away, and Thomas walked back to his house, where Elena was making lunch and Grace was playing with a wooden truck that his uncle had carved from the last piece of the dead wood pile. He sat on the porch and he ate an apple, one of the first of the season, and he looked out at the orchard that stretched before him, row after row of trees that he had planted with his own hands. Trees that had grown from seeds and saplings into a forest of fruit that fed thousands of people he would never meet. He thought about his mother, who had believed in him before anyone else did, who had given him the notebook with the blue cover and told him to write down everything he learned. He thought about his father, who had left and who had never come back and who would never know what his son had built. He thought about the town, who had laughed and who now came to him for advice and for jobs and for apples to serve to their guests. He thought about the men in suits, who would be back next year with a larger number and a better offer, and who would leave again with nothing, because they did not understand that some things cannot be bought, He thought about the granite layer, 30 to 40 feet below the surface, invisible and ancient and patient, waiting for the next person desperate enough to dig. And he thought about Grace, who would be old enough to hold a shovel in 10 years, and who would inherit not just the orchard, but the knowledge of how it was built. The knowledge that the world is full of cursed farms and poisoned soil and dry wells, but that beneath every curse there is a granite layer for those who dig deep enough to find it. He finished his apple and he stood up and he walked to the orchard, because there were trees to prune and soil to test and roots to follow, and because the work was never finished, and because that was the point. The seed does not know the soil is dead. It only knows it has to grow. And Thomas Reed, who had been called crazy by an entire town, who had bought a cursed farm with $347, who had passed out from heat exhaustion and considered a rifle, and been saved by an uncle who smelled of cow manure and pride, who had found a granite layer and built an orchard and turned down $12 million, because some things are not for sale, walked into his trees with a pruning shears in his back pocket and a notebook in his mind, ready to learn what the earth would teach him next, because the farm was not cursed. It had never been cursed. It had only been waiting, and Thomas, who had waited 12 years for the world to catch up to what he knew, was still digging, still growing, still proving that the only thing more powerful than a curse is a boy who refuses to believe in it.